So, thanks for coming here. Foggy Sunday morning. I appreciate you guys being here. Last night we showed The Matrix and we had about 11 people show up, which was great. It was fun. I had some requests to try to do movie night in the future, so I think I've got a co-conspirator for making that happen. So maybe we'll have some more socially things going on, or other people will find movies that go along with their talks that we could do. I think that would be fun. So my talk today is sort of a precursor to thinking about selflessness. And the idea is that we sort of need to know where we are. Where do we stand? What's our preconceived notions of ourselves before we can even start breaking it down and put it into a totally different cultural language, to put it into the terms of Buddhism, and then to start analyzing it in that way. So there's really going to be basically everything that we say here today is going to be wrong. When we start looking at Buddhist philosophy, what we're saying today is actually most likely going to be wrong. And that's okay, because we need to know where we start. We need to sort of analyze our own mind as it is right now before we can start doing the analysis that we find in Lam Rim or in some of the higher trainings. And part of that is actually that we need to just sort of figure out what the language is that goes to certain experiences. So talking about identity, talking about emptiness, for sure, our language gets really confused very quickly. And that's sort of the point of today, is to sort of see where are we confused and can we come to some sort of consensus with ourselves so that we know, oh, hey, that's mind, that's consciousness, that's memory. So that when we start looking and reading the Buddhist text, we have some idea of what our starting point is, and we can start to pick out, oh, that's a little different from what I thought it was. But part of this is that when we talk, and I like to do a lot of participation, how I use, vision may be different from someone else's use of vision. Maybe someone else's idea of consciousness is going to be different from mine. And that's fine. And that's sort of, what are the boundaries of language? What are we dealing with here? And it's actually, we see this in, monastic settings also. Part of the debate is actually what's called a counting debate, where you go through and you actually define things. So you'll start each debate or each series of debates with this, that you're all on the same page. For example, one of the basic ones is, what's the definition of a pot? Tell me. Oh, a pot is a bulbous flat bottom vessel for holding water. Okay, we know what pot is. But we don't have that, especially in Western culture, that correlates to a lot of what the Buddhist texts say about consciousness. What's an eye consciousness? I don't know. I mean, my eye doesn't talk to me, right? So our understanding is already skewed. And our understanding of language comes from culture and society and psychology and how we're made up as humans. So a large part of this talk is actually intended to help you come up with your definitions so that you understand what your starting place is, and sort of what those boundaries are. And if we're totally wrong when we actually start looking at the text, fine, great. We at least know where we're starting. Lama likes to use the analogy of, hey, how do I get to San Francisco? What's the path I take to San Francisco? That's going to be a different path if we're starting here in Sacramento than if we're in Tijuana. So we need to know where we're starting so that we can actually get where we want to go. Does that make sense? Are we all on the same page that we're not actually learning anything about anything except ourselves today? Okay. All right. So here's my first real starting question. Can anyone describe their self or their I to me? Like when you think of yourself, what does that mean? And onliners, please jump in if you want, or we can pass the microphone around. All right. Should have brought some of those candies like toss. players.
Thank you. I'm going to say conventionally, I have this memory of having a lot of conversations with people, and I would try to tell them who I am, and they would be trying to tell me who they are. So we would have conversations about this so we could get to know each other. When I think back to those conversations, I was generally um, using a bunch of words that I found admirable most of the time. I did have a whole story too about things that were difficult for me. And so I would like use those concepts and then try to tell stories that supported those concepts so that I could be seen in a particular way.
Can you give me an example of one of those concepts?
Um, yeah, uh, right now I feel like saying concepts that maybe I didn't necessarily use just because I'm
That's
having
okay.
a difficult time with memory, but like emotionally strong or adventurous. Um, uh, and then there were even negative ones that I think still brought about feelings of self-importance that helped me like solidify something like like kind of like tortured or like like the poet,
Mm.
like something along these lines, things
What
like that.
What do you mean by self-importance?
When I say self-importance, I don't necessarily mean like, I think that term kind of like gives an impression of being like more than others. But really, what I mean is just like a way to define myself in separation from others.
Mm.
Like, so each of us would have our own way of describing our self importance so that we didn't like feel super the same.
Do you think that that is a similar concept that you would apply to your emotional sort of things? Like the separating self from others, does that apply to the emotions that you would use?
Yeah, I think all those ideas were held in a very complex web. So any sort of concept that I brought forth in terms of identification had not only a story but a series of emotional complexes that went with it. So like with the like maybe a tortured artist type, right? Like it's going to have like depth and sadness. An adventurous type thing, if I'm trying to put that forward, is going to have emotions of like courage and I don't know, it's courage and emotion. Maybe it's a feeling or a way of being, but like spontaneity, happiness, so they're kind of going to be like whole complexes.
When you talked about these things, were they all in reference to the past? Did any of them happen right now or future things?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question because when I think back, what I recall is that no, they were not in the moment, right? So these were things all past.
Mm.
And so I was trying to tell about the past in a way to create a persona in the moment, as opposed to like being connected to the moment in an embodied way where I could say, this is my experience, not necessarily who I am, but this is what's happening for me right now.
What about who you hope to be? Future tense. Did
Yes,
you?
that's a big part of it too.
So more about the past and a little bit about the future, but not right. Like right now, not so much.
That is what I recall.
Okay. Do you think that when you were trying to impart to someone these things, it sounded like you were trying to change their opinion or develop a specific opinion? Would that differ from scenario or person or situation?
Yes, because I don't think it wasn't really super intentional, you know? Like maybe sometimes it was a bit intentional. Like I think of like first dates.
Hmm.
I think it's intentional. Like, we're gonna have a story about who we are that puts us in the best light, or like a job interview or something. And
Yeah, job interviews.
yeah, or even like right, like we all have those things. Like I've definitely met people in the work environment that are like, I don't come here to make friends.
Mhm.
Like they're keeping everything about work because they know if they cross that threshold into personal stuff, there's an opportunity to be hurt.
Right.
So I do think that like depending on this, it was more situational. And I find that really interesting when I like take time to review it. Because sometimes I'm like, wow, where did I come up with that one? But it was like it was what the situation was calling for.
Hmm. So let me ask you a question about that. If we were to get some of those people from different situations together and ask them about Matthew, do you think they would know from a third party perspective that we're talking about one Matthew?
Probably just because you would be using the same identifier.
Well, how many
But
Susans do we have in here?
right. So you know what I mean? Like if there is some way for all these people from different places in my life to hear the stories of others without like some commonality, then I'm not sure that they would know.
So how do you keep that as your one self? Or do you think that you now have many selves?
I mean,
Or is that something you've even contemplated?
at that time, no, I don't think I contemplated that. I mean, I would say like I think I used language more about like feeling fragmented,
Mm,
like knowing I couldn't be my whole self in certain situations because I wouldn't be there wouldn't be a sense of belonging.
okay. So even though you were presenting sort of different slivers of yourself in different situations, you felt that sort of disbursement. So, like yourself, who you felt you were, was whole, but you could only be part of yourself in different situations. Am I hearing that correct?
I feel like that's an accurate statement.
How did you feel, or what did that feel like to be divided outwardly, but unified internally? Or can you talk about what that means today? Like right now, are you a unified self? There's just one Matthew in that creature over there that I'm conversing with right now, rather than, five different Matthews that are sort of added together to make a whole.
The experience of that.
The first person experience.
So in the past, when I was really into that sort of thing, I would say that the experience was feeling often separated, unseen, and not like not sure I was um, um, like able to be everything I could be.
Mm,
Felt very limited, like things were in the dark.
okay. So if you want to pass off, that's fine. But um, as we think about our memories of what we did in the past, you have memories of sort of being bifurcated or trifurcated or splintered in a way. And then today, those are just memories. It's not your current experience. So, what holds all of that together for you? If you had to name something or describe the self that is over time enduring, how would you describe that? Or can you describe that? No, that's okay. It's a tough question. There's not an easy
I think
question.
it depends. I am going to pass off here because I feel
Okay.
like I've been on the hot seat for too long. But uh, I mean, I'll stay here, but like, it's starting to feel a little bit like speak of identity, like the Matthew show. So,
Well, but some of these challenges are really hard. I mean, it's hard
yeah,
to sort of think about it until we try to put words to it. We're like, I don't know. It's just sort of this, sort of that. Like, wait, that's a weird question.
yeah, and I think that like there's a struggle because it's almost like I want to ask you, like, well, what on what level are we speaking? Like, do we? Yeah,
We have
I'm
some.
having mental. whispered in my ear. But I mean, if we're speaking about like conventional reality, that's one thing. But like I have been fortunate enough to hear the Dharma and have a really high level master as a teacher. So that process has changed things for me on a particular level too.
Right.
Um, and so like conventionally we can just have like kind of a fun conversation, but I think it's going to get a little boring. On like a different like Dharma type level, then I would probably choose this like kind of like I don't want to try to even
Okay.
quantify or describe.
Yeah. And I think that's actually an important distinction, is that when we start talking about conventional reality and ultimate reality and emptiness and selflessness, that then it gets even more confusing sometimes. Like I'll find myself studying and thinking about, okay, so how does memory work? How do I actually have a continuum from when I was, this big and I remember falling downstairs or standing underneath the kitchen table, which clearly I'm not able to do now. How am I the same? How is that actually a continuum? What's the continuum? Is there a continuum? And so through study, I think we sort of break down little layers, but then I'll have a concept of something like time. And then eventually I'm confronted with, wait, my ideas about past, present, and future, and how I'm going to exist tomorrow or how I exist right now, start to get whittled away. I mean, it's just like those layers of onion that we start peeling away, and we're like, I don't know what's going on anymore. So that's why I think it's still a valid inquiry, even if we've done a lot of study and contemplation already. But thank you so much, Matthew, for sharing. That's great. And I think it's a common experience. Uh, Jessica has a comment. Jessica, I'm going to read that if that's okay. So in response to the question, how do I identify the self for me? She says her name, my mother's daughter, had been a friend and a student, an American, a girlfriend, a wife, a mother, a teacher, etc. Relatively speaking, who I am in relationship to others. And there is a different way, especially culturally, when we start thinking about psychology and sociology, that interplays with our physical selves. And all those things help us develop this sense of self, but there's a third person perspective and a first person perspective. What is my internal narrative? And what is it that I allow other people to see of that? How do they see me, and how do they think I am? Who do they think I am? Or what do they think I am? Could differ, right? So if you've never been to Lion's Roar before, if you've never encountered Buddhism before, but you're purely from a theistic religion, you might say, oh, well, that person is like this, they're a good person. They probably believe in God. They probably have similar beliefs to me. They probably do these things to be good people, to help others. But our sense of that is going to be different, right? If we don't think of a creator as having created us in his image or whatever, then we're going to have a different idea of self and what that means. So there's sort of in Western philosophy, and I'm going to bring this up a lot because Lama really wanted me to talk about this book, Losing Ourselves by Jay Garfield. And he takes the concept of selflessness. He says, well, then, okay, what are we? We're persons. So that's his answer, is how do we actually define this as a person, not as a self? I sort of disagree with him on that point, but that's for a different day. But what he actually does is he goes through a lot of Western philosophy, a lot. So the underpinnings of Western culture. What do we see in movies? What do we see in cartoons? How did we grow up? What's the sort of American ideal of an independent, active, go-getter, pull yourself up by the bootstraps, capitalist sort of self, and then correlates it to Buddhism? Says, hey, well, these are sort of the differences. So it's philosophy heavy. It's a great book. Take your time with it. I've been through it multiple times and I'm still not done with it. There's sort of three broad categories in Western philosophy about how we think that we are the same self. So, yesterday, today, now to now. So these broad categories are, first, physical continuity of the self, psychological continuity of the self, and then soul. So a physical continuity is, we have a body and everything is intrinsically tied to that physical form. So if my body is destroyed, there's no more self. There's no more. Connor's gone. It's over. It's done. And you can start sort of peeling away what those layers mean. How much of ourself is our brain? Well, in this theory, if you look at just sort of a pure form, everything is the brain. So if the brain goes wonky, the self is no longer there. You get hit in the head, gone. You get Alzheimer's, self is not there. It's not a continuity of self. Psychological continuity of self is tied to perpetual psychological or mental states. So even though I'm sleeping, there's stuff going on, right? Maybe I'm dreaming, I'm thinking. I could just be a brain in a vat, right? So just brain hanging out in a vat of juicy, yummy, tasty stuff. And, there's psychological things going on, mental states, and that's fine. There's no body, there's no physical form really that's necessary to sustain this. So, a devastating physical injury is not going to necessarily change that. But, you take psychotropic drugs and maybe you get anesthesia a little bit too heavy and those mental states stop, then we've lost continuity. And the last one's the big one that Buddhism really sort of harps on is the soul. And that's an immaterial substance of self. There's no Atman. There's no homunculus, no little man in our brain telling us what to do. I actually used to think that there was a homunculus in the streetlights. Its only job was to turn the streetlights on. And so when they didn't come on or they came on late, it was like, oh yeah, we get to play longer and they're being nice to us. But this sort of enduring soul, that's what really Buddhism is saying now. There's no extra something that keeps us going. That is ourself. So, when you start to, if you want to read that book, or if you look at other books about identity, sometimes that's what it's called in Western philosophy, you start to see that all these different permutations of, well, a little bit of this much materialism and this much idealism, this much psychological stuff comes in, and it's all been mulled over, and you can get really sort of in the weeds pretty quick about different arguments for these things. But I think our experience is actually the more important part. How do we actually conceive of ourself? And so when we think about selflessness, what do we actually talk about? Which is one of the reasons why I wanted to show The Matrix last night. So who has seen The Matrix recently or remembers it? Okay. So the basic point about The Matrix is that you have a world, and you have people living in the world and going to work or getting up late or going out and partying. Turns out that's not actually real. That's just a program that's being run in the brains of all the humans who are now basically a power source for robots. So if we look at humans and selves from the point of Thomas Anderson, from the point of people in that world, in that simulation, what is a self? And does that self differ when they find out that that was a program? Is there a change? Does the definition of a self change between I'm here, this is my life, this is what I do, this is who I am, this is how I behave, this is what I like to eat, this is how I taste food, to now the world has changed. Have I changed? I have a physical body now. I'm not just in a program. How would that actually change their perspective, or could that change your perspective of yourself? Any thoughts? Yeah.
So I'm thinking of the Matrix. If your identity is based on the roles, kind of like Jessica was talking about, I'm a mom, I'm a sister, you know what I mean? All these variety of roles, then when you take yourself out of that circumstance, you don't have those roles anymore. So that would be a change. In the case of Neo being put into a different circumstance, he still responded very much like he did when he was in the Matrix.
Mhm.
So his response was the same.
But he didn't have those roles. He didn't have a job.
Right.
He definitely wasn't, we didn't see him programming. It's questionable whether or not he was programming, but there is that difference in roles. So how do we understand the roles? And let me ask that maybe in a different way. If I think about the role of a mother here in the US, and this is something that people have a hard time with, and then I think about the role of mother in Buddhism, maybe in a society that was predominantly Buddhism. A lot of us say, I can't do that meditation about the mother because my mother was mean or my mother left or I didn't have a mother. But culturally, there's a different identity of mother. It's the caring, it's the nurturing. So when we change even the definitions of the roles, does that change? If you're a mother here in the US, are you also a mother in China? Are you also a mother in Tibet? And this is sort of, it's really a different end of that same spectrum of we've taken you out of the roles that you used to know because we've just redefined them. So what do you think?
I'm not necessarily, well, I'm still thinking more in terms of the Matrix. So you could,
So consider this. Maybe Neo is not gone from knowing he's in a computer program to being in a real life situation. Let's say he's gone from an American to move to India.
does he still have the same roles? Is that what we're asking?
Yeah, or is his identity still possibly connected with those roles in the same way?
Okay.
We're phoning a friend. I'm gonna flip it and I'm gonna say, maybe don't pay attention to his role, pay attention to his actions. Because, think about that, right? Despite, never mind what your role is, think about how you act in every specific situation and what does that tell you about that person, whether we say it, that's the person on the driver's license, or whether that's their mental continuum or such. I would think, look to the action.
So behavior. Okay. So his behavior, though, he's maybe not all that strong-willed as Thomas Anderson. He's a little bit nerdy. He doesn't go out and do stuff. He doesn't seem like he's going to be the guy to punch someone out. And then he gets out of the Matrix and he's in the real world and he's like ready to go. He's, doing Kung Fu, right? So how does that change his role? How does that change his behavior, right? Sort of the nerdy kind who's not going to do much to, oh, I'm going to fight you. That's a behavioral shift. What happened? How would you explain that? Oh,
I have an idea, but I'm.
What wasn't the original question, what happens when you become embodied? Wasn't that the original question?
no, the original question is what happens when we change the definition of the role?
You talked about, I don't know the Matrix, I don't remember it, but, you talked about characters in this movie who were programmed. And then somehow or another, they ended up not being programmed and being embodied and in the real world. So, I mean, you did ask that question.
I
Okay.
did, yeah.
So that's where this all comes from, is what's the difference between being embodied and not being embodied? Isn't that correct?
We sort of went down a different path though. So then we got into, well, roles. What's the difference of our definition of roles rather than just, is it? Tell me more about that.
Just in meditation, one of the very first basic meditations is learning to be in your body. So it's a fundamental meditation technique.
How does that help you define yourself?
It adds it. What's the word I'm looking for? Completeness. There's dimension, there's broader dimension, there's deeper dimension. There's all of a sudden, or hopefully, eventually, a identification that is below the neck.
So how does that play out with the Buddhist concept of reincarnation and cyclic existence? If you want to put a lot of emphasis on body right now and embodiment, then how do you get from life to life to life? And the body is only one piece of it. So I don't think that you can actually emphasize that very hardly, very strongly, because we want to practice for the next life. And our next life will have a different body entirely. Yeah. 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 So, yeah, Susan just said that's one way of looking at it, but another way of looking at it is practice for right now. Can you leave the mic with Susan for a second?
Yes, we have people on the back.
Susan doesn't want the mic.
This body is physically taking this neck. Unless you do.
So let me ask you a question, Susan. Let's say that tomorrow you are in a car crash and you lose all feeling from the neck down.
And I what?
You lose all feeling from the neck down.
Right.
How does that change your embodiment? Does that change your ability to practice?
No,
So why is your body important?
because it is a piece of practice. It's not all of practice.
So what else goes into that?
What else goes into what?
Practice and self.
Well, it's body, speech, mind. There's three pieces.
Okay, so what do you mean by speech?
Do you want to get into the whole Samokakaya?
No, what I want to get into is what is your opinion of speech? How do you actually view that yourself? And think about this from the perspective of you have been doing this for 20 years plus, but some of us haven't. So some of us think body, speech, mind, oh, that's just my physical ability to talk. Or my body is just my physical ability to move around and interact with others. But if we take away parts of that, how do we still have a self? And this is where our identities get really difficult, and where when we start talking about selflessness, we get into all these other broader categories of, well, what if I lose my eyes? That's part of my body, right? But now I've lost a major sense perception, a major way that I interact. And so my ability to like even find my cup and take a drink to feed my body could be limited. So what are the boundaries and what actually defines us as ourselves? So we're not talking about any narrow category. We got to talk about everything. We need to think about everything. And I think that's the fun part about this, is that we can't isolate one thing.
I think that's what I'm saying. I think that's what I'm saying. Yeah.
All right. I think we've got one more comment over here.
I don't know if it's a question slash comment, but just we were talking about Neo, what came to mind was like the villain in the movie, and I can't remember his name right now, but
The Smiths.
okay, so whether he was in or out of the matrix, he kind of held that same, self, that identity, like selfishness, a little more selfish.
You're talking about the guy that turned him in.
Yes.
Yeah, okay.
Okay, so regardless of knowing the truth or not, his kind of nature was the same, pretty selfish. So like that's where, and I don't really know where I'm going with this all the way, except like kind of not predestination or like this self that you have, how much can it change with how to even when knowing the truth and being exposed to it. It's kind of like a question more.
Yeah. So that character was out of the Matrix. He had grown up in the Matrix, gotten out into the real world, but he had these characteristics, these psychological states, these mental states, that attachments that crossed from being in the real world to going back into the computer program. So some of these things are consistent, but maybe some rules aren't. And what's the boundaries of those consistencies? Sort of like Matthew was talking about, here at work, maybe someone is, I'm not here to make friends. I just want to do my job. That's it. That's all I'm going to do. You guys can just leave me alone. We'll interact on this business level, very transactional, versus a first date. Like, hey, yeah, I'm sexy, I'm romantic, I love flowers, here's some chocolates, I mean, let's do this. Oh, you like puppies? I love puppies also. I hate dogs, so you might have that different persona there, but then some things, some traits like this selfishness thing, this discontent that he expressed in that role might cross all of them. So maybe you're really happy and like you're happy at work, but you're like, we're just here to work. We're just here to do transactions. That's it. There's no lovey-dovey stuff here going on. But maybe that happiness is across all of your little sections. Maybe that happiness is across time, or maybe your depression is across time. But those are feelings, right? So it's not a body thing, it's a mental thing. So maybe your body changes. I mean, we used to be this big and now we're, really big. We're really big, like some of us. So what are the things that keep us us? And I think Daniel had a
before I started studying Buddhism, I studied Advaita Vedanta quite a lot. And there was a teacher who did a guided meditation on what they call neti neti, not this, not that, right? And it's this process of, asking, is the self in this body, for example? Is it in these roles? Is it in this experience? Is it in these relationships? And it goes on and on and on. All the usual sort of identifiers that we use as self. And we begin to see like, no, I'm not in my fingernails. No, I'm not in, my relationship as a child of my parents. I'm not that. That's something, but it's not me. And there's this dropping away, dropping away, dropping away. And this sort of mirrored my own life experience, right? Waking state, dreaming state, sleep with no dreams, right? So that sort of everything's changing, right? My body's always changing. My relationships are always, everything's always shifting. Take some groovy drugs. Now, all of a sudden, like the whole world shifts, everything's different, right? But there was always this sort of continuity of awareness. There was something that was aware, but that something is not a thing, right? And within that particular tradition, they say that's what you are. That's you. But it's not a thing.
Yeah, that's the concept of the Atman.
Right, exactly.
That Buddhism denies.
Precisely.
So I think the idea of a soul is very integrated into Western culture in ways that we don't maybe even think about, right? If we think about Descartes meditations, I think, therefore I am. I'm a thinking thing, right? So that thing that thinks is a immaterial substance, a soul. He even has the evil deceptor that's deceived him about all his perceptions and all his roles and all his things that he could touch, but he can't deceive something that's not there. And so that immaterialism of this Atman, this soul, this essence is pretty pervasive in our culture. So what is it that keeps Neo from Thomas Anderson to Neo? Is it this sort of immaterial selfiness, maybe? And so that's one of our preconceived notions that I think we grow up with, and that's sort of subtle in our culture sometimes, right? Like, you can be the same person who came from nothing and became a multi-million-dollar person, and you can have this evolution, and there's something in you that is the same. But that's what we need to start actually peeling away those layers of what is that concept? How are we actually perceiving that when that's not actually correct?
Mm. So this idea that there is no core self is kind of what we're saying. When I think back, like a very, very early memory, I think I was like 3 years old. It was Christmas. My parents dumped me at a Christmas party with a bunch of people I didn't know. They were making cookies, Christmas trees on a stick. I thought that was really cool, but I remember I didn't know how to behave. I didn't know how to interact with people. I didn't know what their expectations of me were. And I think a lot of that was just not, it was like, who am I supposed to be here with these strangers, right? What are their expectations? Should I be worried? My parents aren't here. I don't know anybody. There's just these adults and these kids, and I don't know anybody. I don't know what to do. Is the Christmas tree going to poison me, right? The Christmas tree on a stick. I just remember trying to figure out, who am I supposed to be when I was very young? And I feel like, and I've had this conversation with Lama too, I feel like we're all like little mirrors reflecting back to the other person the characteristics or behaviors that are expected of them or that are anticipated. And I find that I do that. I feel like I feel people's expectations and I reflect back what they expect of me. And then I recognize that I've done that. I'm like, I gotta stop that. And I gotta like foggy up their mirror, right? So I don't see that. But in the core of all of that, that little 3-year-old confused girl was the recognition of no self, not knowing who to be, like starting to construct something.
Maybe starting to see yourself not just as related to your parents, but as related to other people, other humans, and not knowing what those other humans are like because you just didn't have enough experience.
So that would mean that our self is a constant construct with other people.
I'm sorry?
The way you posited it, it's in relation to.
So yeah, there's always sort of a first person and a third person position here, right? So we've really been focusing more on the third person position, but a first person position would be, I think about these things. I have these memories. So right now you have those memories of being a 3-year-old and confused and unsure of yourself and maybe a little terrified. But your feelings of that, your emotions that you've attached to those memories that had emotions, that's your first person perspective. And how you relate those memories to right now, who you are now, what you do, how you think now, that's all the first person perspective. I don't have access to that. There's really no good way for you to actually give me access to that. And one way to sort of actually think about this is that there are people who have like a running dialogue in their head I've got that. I've got the person inside me that always talks to me and tells me what to say and considers things. And it's actually like a voice that I hear that I interact with. And it's a little weird, but there are people who don't have that voice in their head that think differently. And so I can't understand how they think. What's going on in there? How is it just quiet? I have a hard time imagining just that quietness, that not overture that keeps going, that is me, right? That's sort of what I think of as me, is that voice that keeps talking and considering things and how it considers and how I bring up memories. Whereas I think that there are people who definitely have a much more visual brain. And so they see colors or see words or whatever, and that's how they think. So that's the first person perspective or experience of self and how we've constructed that. Does that make sense? Okay. The third person construction is really how we interact with people. So, yeah.
Hi, Connor.
Hey.
Nice to see you. And thank you for the Matrix tonight. I watched a half-an-hour show just explaining the Matrix to me afterwards. So
Nice.
which is worth it because there was a lot. When I get to selflessness, I think of in the self, who's holding who accountable.
Oh, accountability.
Okay. Yeah, there's got to be accountability somewhere.
What do you mean by that?
My actions or actions in general, how I relate to action, stimulus, response.
How does accountability be held?
That's a good question. In self, in somewhere, it's got to start with something.
Let me ask you a question. Is there some, oh, that was a bad action, you did a bad thing, you need to go do penance, you need to go, I don't know, walk on shells or
No,
something?
there's no response sometimes.
Okay.
It is as it is.
Is it only in regards to negative actions that accountability is held?
Yeah, that's a good question. We avoid all negative actions. So, but I know that. And so moving forward, I try to act as my future self. And, but it's, again, it all starts with something. And I'm just trying to figure out if there's no soul. That's a tough one for me. And, because it's got to start somewhere. There's got to be a seer of truth somewhere. I don't mean to be provocative or anything like that.
No, this is actually the point, is that we need to know what our starting point is. What do we actually think? What is our, if we have this cultural perspective, this idea that there's a soul, what does that mean? And then, if we want to continue studying Buddhism, how do we actually relate that or analyze it from the Buddhist perspective? So, soul, great, good, go for it. But understand what that means to you. So, is it just the part of you that's held accountable? Is that what you mean by soul? Well, I don't know. Is soul something more enduring? Is soul enduring across lifetimes? Are there actually additional lifetimes, or is it just this? And then the soul is rewarded or punished, or just poof? I mean, those are sort of the ideas, like what are the boundaries of your self-conception?
Yeah, I like that. I like boundaries.
So try to, in your own time, figure those out. Try to put words to it. Because the more language we put to something, the different concepts that we overlay again and again. What are roles? What is body? What's the limits of body? What's speech? What's a soul? What's my soul? What are those layers that we've wrapped around that? How do we actually sort of start to parse that out so that if we do want to go into selflessness, we want to start thinking about emptiness, what are we starting with? What's the starting package? Anyone else?
I'm just gonna come back to that 3-year-old self, and how she was thinking is probably how I see myself. So maybe not the body, maybe not the history. I didn't have much history then, but maybe the way that she was thinking is how I see myself.
Yeah, so sort of the experience of emotion and the affect that that has on your body, maybe. No? All right.
So somebody earlier said about awareness, which I see is different from soul. But this is just me, so whatever that is, right? But I feel like there needs to be maybe some definition of terms, because we talk about awareness, and then we talk about soul, and then we talk about mind stream. And if you start to begin, if you're talking about things that have no beginning and end, and yet are changing through time, I feel like, anyway, I feel like we need some clarification.
So how would you define
No,
those?
No. You're not,
Well,
nice try.
okay. All right, but here's why. Yeah, Jen, this
I
is
am
why
just
it's important.
asking.
I know. So the thing is that I could define those. We could get Oxford English Dictionary to define those. We could get Geshe Damsho to define those, but they may not match how you think about them, what your conceptuality is them, because Geshe Damsho didn't grow up in a Western Christian culture. Geshe Damsho didn't grow up watching cartoons. Geshe Damsho does not have the same history that you have to develop these things, right? I mean, think about, Mickey and Minnie Mouse. Who are Mickey and Minnie Mouse? You ask Geshe Damsho, and he's going to go ears, right? So his relationship to who Mickey and Minnie Mouse might be is different from ours. A relationship of watching Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer and being, very happy that Rudolph finally got a place in the line to do something with his giant red nose, right? I mean, that's sort of, I have this oddity and now I can be the savior of the world. That's a different concept. So that's part of maybe, hey, I can do this even though I'm a little different from the norm. That may not be part of what you think of in Tibet or India or China or Mexico. There might be a different cultural concept that has different boundaries. So how you think of what awareness is awareness the little talking voice I have in my head? Is that my emotions? Is that a soul? How I think about that is going to be different how you think about that. So you defining these terms for yourself, I think, is actually really important. Because until you know what you're talking about, until you have a clear understanding of what that means, even trying to communicate awareness to someone else is going to be hard. A continuum of consciousness. What does that mean?
Well, it's like what I was talking about, the way the 3-year-old was thinking.
So the way someone thinks.
Can be thinking today.
We actually do have some participants online. So the mic, okay. So if we say a continuum of consciousness, is this a continuum of my mental consciousness? Is this a continuum of my eye consciousness? Is this a continuum of my auditory consciousness? There's a reason why the Heart Sutra says no eye, no ear, no nose, no mouth, no body, no visual form, no sound, right? Ear and sound is different. So these are sort of different concepts when we start looking at Buddhism, but what does it actually mean to you when you say that? Do you mean the little voice that keeps talking in your head, if you have that, or, the constant cursor or images that float by, or feelings or colors or whatever it is that you think of continuum and that you think of consciousness.
Yep, I was gonna say, so first
Yeah.
thing, someone responded in the chat. And then the second thing, I'm hopefully gonna help all of us, and I'm gonna say, you need to speak a little further. So we've learned that you have an inner voice that speaks to you. Not everyone has an inner voice, right? Like you think
Mhm.
about Temple Grandin, someone who, thinks only in visual imagery, has no auditory input whatsoever inside of her
Yeah, I
head.
can't imagine that.
I know, I can't imagine it either. Then you have people who are synesthesia,
Mhm.
right? So synesthesia,
Again,
there's no auditory,
Can't imagine
and
that.
visual is not static,
Right.
right? So the visual is
Auditory or something else or whatever.
the visual is auditory and constantly moving, right? So there's no static imagery, like we're used to seeing static imagery. So I think all of us are wondering, you keep asking us to define it, maybe lead by example and tell us how you defined it, so that then we get an idea from there how to define it for ourselves. Okay, big high five from everybody.
Yeah, all right. So the comment, just to give some credence to that, aggregates and skandhas was one of them. And then Jessica just responded again. Continuity of Jessica, though, expresses as dependent arising in each present moment. Not sure about awareness. Awareness is the present moment. So one of the reasons why I really wanted to do this talk is because I don't actually have good answers to this. And it's actually been a little frustrating to me, because then I read something more about, oh, well, the eye consciousness. How do we actually perceive that, or how do we deal with our perceptions, specifically our 5 sense perceptions, not talking about mental consciousness? When I start breaking those down, sometimes I go, well, my visual, what I see is very dominant. I'm a very dominant seer rather than auditory or gustatory or physical. But I'm aware of all these other things. And does what I see depend on what I hear? I'm sort of at that age where I'm like, you got to turn down the radio because I need to make a right-hand turn. Why? Why? What does that have? What does my auditory perception have to do with my ability to see where the turn is? It doesn't seem to have anything to do with it. And yet, it is easier, or it's more comfortable, or it changes my awareness from being sort of spread out, maybe, and my awareness being my little yickety yakety thing going on, or even my conceptual awareness, which doesn't seem to have a yickety yakety inner voice, but just sort of thinks, hey, yeah, the turn's going to be the next one up there, and you're just going to go for it. Well, yeah, so those sort of hunches, that emotional sort of experience of the affect is a little bit different from, maybe what's going on in my internal world, or my experience of the external world of cars coming and traffic and birds. So David Dennett actually has this thing that he calls his phenomenological garden. Like, what's in the garden? What's there? What's going on? And he actually divides it into those 3 things: experiences of the external world, experiences of a purely internal world, and then experiences of emotion or affect. So external world would be, the sights, sounds, the feelings, hot, cold, and my hand up in the air, what's going on with that. Purely internal is like fantasies. Oh yeah, I want to go out with that person. I'm hungry. The daydreaming, how I'm talking to myself, my hunch that it's going to be the 3rd driveway on the right that I need to turn into, even though I've never been here. And then my experience of the emotional world is, pain. Actually, hunger would fall into that for him. But joy, anger, fear, lust, astonishment, all those things are sort of the emotional affect that he says. But they all happen at the same time. But they're independent but related. And I think a lot of these things, like stream of consciousness or continuity of consciousness, are different but related things. So I really don't have any answers. I wanted you guys to give me some answers. But part of this is also just figuring out what your own personal boundaries are so that when we do talk about body, speech, and mind, when we do talk about the 5 aggregates or the skandhas, what does that actually mean? And how do we actually relate to that with what we know now? So I can meditate all I want on what a text says something is. But until I actually look at what I experience that is, or I want to say it is, or how I want to put words to that, I have 2 separate things. I've sort of divided myself into, oh, this is the part that knows things. This is the wisdom part. Maybe this is the meditative part about who I am and what I'm doing, but I haven't joined them together. I don't have a unified theory, right? I don't have a unified experience. I haven't actually sort of figured this out as one thing rather than separate things. And I think that's sort of the fun part is let's do the introspective work so that we can do the work of bringing it together. Matthew did mention before conventional versus ultimate, and that's a whole nother layer of how do we actually integrate our ideas of selflessness into how we behave, how we act, how we respond, or how we think about ourselves. I think that's a totally like, that's the 500 level course and we're still in the 60s. We haven't even gotten to pre-college. We're just, elementary school. So I think that really doing this work and asking these tough questions and debating what does this mean? Having that debate with yourself first, and then with others, and then how does this relate to the text? Those, I think, are some good pre-stages for this particular topic. Any other further comments or questions? Because this is waiting. We've been going on for an hour already. Yeah. All right. Let's do a dedication and prayers unless there's nothing else. Thank you.
Let's begin. Due to the merits of these virtuous actions, may I quickly attain the state of a Guru Buddha and lead all living beings without exception into that enlightened state. May the supreme jewel bodhicitta that is not arisen arise and grow, and may that which has arisen not diminish but increase more and more. In the land encircled by snow mountains, you are the source of all goodness, all happiness and good, all powerful Chenrezig Tenzin Gyatso. Please remain until samsara ends. May the teachings of the Buddha flourish, and may the upholders of the teachings remain forever. May all migrators achieve happiness, and may they fulfill all their temporary and ultimate goals. Losang, magical display of the deep awareness of all the victorious ones, merciful giver of a stream of profound and vast instructions to the fortunate migrators, please remain always unperishing, unchanging, unfading. Avalokiteshvara, great treasure of objectless compassion. Manjushri, master of flawless wisdom. Vajrapani, destroyer of the entire host of Maras. Sankapa, crown jewel of the snowy land sages. Losang Dragpa, I make request at your holy feet. Are there any announcements? Next Saturday, the 21st, LRDC, Roar Dharma Center, is going to have an open house from 2 p.m. to 4 p.m. Of course, you are welcome to come earlier and to help us put cookies in your mouth and in bags and to get ready for people that might be visiting and coming. And of course, we are hoping you will tell everyone, come visit. I know our fearless assistants, Brad, Doug, I can't remember who else are going to put out signs on the 17th in and around the neighborhood. I might be making up that date. Susan gave me I don't know. Okay, we're hoping for the 17th. So tell your friends, tell your family, tell your neighbors, tell your own internal self. Whether that self is debatable. So you got to figure that out by the 21st. Kidding. But come and see what's happening at the LRDC.
Thank you for the wonderful talk. I'm always happy to help with the confusion. We had a sacred objects campaign, and just want to say that I'm around if you would like for me to collect a check or cash or whatever. You can also put it online, make your donation that you pledged online, but be sure to indicate in the drop down what it's for our tracking purposes. Yeah. Thanks. Yeah, there are a few that are still open for donation. So if there's something there that you like and it hasn't been already, I mean, just go ahead and put it in the basket. Give us a contact number too.
Then on that line with checks and cash or going to the QR code and making donations, just wanted to say, let's celebrate each other. These open, public, in-person spaces are collapsing at a rapid rate. We have a place here to come together. Let's support it, give money to keep the lights on and keep programs going. I know that there is something magical in the air, a little quiet voice about dancing. And if you're interested in dancing, you could talk to Jessica Mayer offline and start to bring energy to her ideas and see if we could come together. And there's so much more we could do here together besides what's already going on, which is a lot. So please come be together and support your community.
Dirk?
Hi, yeah, I just wanted to break the news that we'll be doing an all-day recitation on January 1st. I believe it's the 7th. We'll be reciting the King of Prayers. It's known as widely, it's the aspiration of Samantabhadra is the actual name of the prayer. And we'll do that from 9 a.m., I mean, to 5 p.m. Pacific time. And sign-up sheet for that for leading that, so you don't have to have any special qualifications, but you probably would be better off if you know how to read. Sign-up sheet for that will probably be going out pretty soon.
Hey, Dirk, is there any aspiration to have an in-person group here at the temple with that, or is it just online?
Last year we did it with both, and if we can do it with both, that would be great.
I'd be willing to be here for that. Yeah,
And-
on the first to. Is it the first or the second, Dirk? It is actually the first, right?
No, you were at the first, yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah,
okay.
and we just did that in the temple just before we had Zoom.
Yeah.
Yeah.
January.
Yeah.
January 1st, New Year's Day.
Well, yeah, I think we may need a written announcement about that, Dirk, because we're easily confused right now.
There will be.
Myself. Yes.
I have another announcement. I believe it's on the 22nd. Patty's not here today, but we're having a refuge and pathers, right? Huh? 22nd. Yeah. So if anybody is, interested on the edge, want to be, if you do the path, you don't have to take refuge vows, but you're just sort of open to learning and exploring and getting to know the teacher, Lama Jinpa. And then if you decide to go for it and take the refuge vows, and that's exciting. And anyway, it's a beautiful ceremony, and there's lots of support for you here. So jump on in.
Mo araya pacayana indi Om araya pacana